Hi, I'm Sarah Chen-Morrison. When I found my husband Marcus chained to a water pipe in my childhood home's basement, barely conscious and covered in bruises, I never imagined my own brother would be responsible. What my brother Derek didn't know was that our father wasn't just any judge. He was Chief Justice William Chen of the Supreme Court, and he had spent 30 years building a reputation on one principle. No one is above the law, not even family. By the time Dad was finished, Derek didn't just lose his freedom, he lost everything. And our family learned that sometimes justice and love required the same terrible choice.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Life in the Chen family had always revolved around expectations and excellence. Growing up in our sprawling colonial house in Georgetown, with its perfectly manicured gardens and floor-to-ceiling law books, I learned early that being the daughter of Chief Justice William Chen meant living under a microscope. Every decision, every friendship, every grade was scrutinized, not just by our father, but by a world that watched his family for any sign of weakness or scandal. My brother Derek was 3 years older than me, and from childhood he struggled to live up to the impossible standards our father set. Where I excelled in school and followed rules religiously, Derek was rebellious, impulsive, and constantly testing boundaries. Dad would spend hours lecturing him about responsibility and consequences, about how our family name carried weight that couldn't be tarnished by poor choices. But Derek never seemed to listen. By the time I graduated from Harvard Law and married Marcus Morrison, a brilliant environmental attorney I'd met during my internship at the EPA, Derek had already been through 2 failed businesses, a brief stint in rehab, and countless family interventions. Our mother Grace, a former federal prosecutor who had given up her career to support Dad's judicial ambitions, spent most family gatherings making excuses for Derek's latest disappointments. Marcus fit perfectly into our family's expectations. He was educated, principled, and shared Dad's passion for justice, though he focused on environmental law rather than constitutional issues. Our wedding 2 years ago had been featured in Washington Society magazine, a tasteful affair that reflected the Chen family's status without appearing ostentatious. Derek had been my brother's best man, despite my private reservations about his reliability. The problems with Derek had escalated over the past year. What started as borrowing money became stealing from Mom's purse. What began as occasional drinking became daily vodka bottles hidden around his apartment. Most concerning was his growing resentment toward Marcus, whom he saw as the golden son-in-law who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. "Why does he get to be perfect?" Derek had slurred during last Christmas dinner, pointing his wine glass accusingly at Marcus. "Environmental lawyer, Harvard graduate, saves the planet for a living, makes the rest of us look like failures." Dad had quietly escorted Derek outside to cool off, but I saw the hurt in Marcus's eyes. He had tried so hard to be accepted by my family, especially by Derek, who seemed determined to hate him. Marcus and I had been living in our cozy townhouse in Alexandria, planning our future together. We talked about starting a family, maybe moving to a bigger place with a yard where our future children could play. Marcus had just won a major case against an industrial polluter, and his firm was considering him for partner. Everything felt like it was falling into place. I should have seen the warning signs. Derek's increasingly erratic behavior, his sudden interest in our daily routines, the way he would show up unannounced at our house asking strange questions about Marcus's schedule. But I was so focused on my own career as a civil rights attorney and my marriage that I missed the darkness growing in my brother's mind. The last normal conversation I had with Derek was 3 weeks before everything fell apart. He had called me sounding more sober and coherent than he had in months. "Sarah," he said, "I know I've been a disappointment to this family. I know Marcus is everything I should have been, but I want you to know that I love you and I'm going to make things right." At the time, I thought he was finally ready to get his life together. I had no idea he was planning something that would destroy our family forever. It was a Tuesday morning when Marcus didn't come home from his morning jog. He had a routine as predictable as clockwork. Up at 5:30, coffee, then a 3-mile run through the neighborhood before showering and heading to his law firm. By 8 a.m., when his assistant called asking where he was for an important client meeting, my stomach dropped through the floor. I called his cell phone repeatedly, each ring echoing in our empty townhouse like an accusation. I drove his usual jogging route twice, looking for any sign of him, checking with neighbors who might have seen something unusual. Nothing. Marcus had simply vanished between leaving our front door and wherever he was supposed to end up. The police were initially unhelpful. Adults have the right to disappear, Officer Rodriguez explained when I filed the missing person report. Has your husband been under any stress lately? Any marital problems? I wanted to scream at him that Marcus would never just leave, that something terrible had happened. But I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Another worried wife jumping to conclusions. By the second day, with still no word from Marcus, I was frantic. I had called everyone we knew, posted on social media, contacted hospitals. My parents came over to help coordinate search efforts, and even Dad used his connections to push the police investigation forward. Mom made endless pots of coffee while Dad worked his phone, calling in favors from prosecutors and FBI contacts who owed him professional courtesies. Derek had been surprisingly supportive during those first 2 days. He came by the house both evenings, bringing takeout food that I couldn't eat, and sitting with me while I called Marcus's friends and colleagues. "We'll find him, Sarah," he kept saying, putting his arm around my shoulders. "Marcus is smart. He's tough. Whatever happened, he'll figure out how to come home to you." It was Derek who suggested we check our childhood home. "Maybe he went there for some reason," he said on Thursday evening, after the police had officially elevated Marcus to an active missing person case. "You know how he likes to walk through Mom's rose garden when he's thinking through difficult cases? Maybe he went there and had some kind of accident." The idea seemed far-fetched, but I was desperate. Our parents had been staying at our house to help coordinate the search efforts, so the Georgetown house was empty. Derek offered to come with me, claiming he wanted to check the basement and attic for any signs that Marcus might have been there. Sometimes people seek out quiet places when they're overwhelmed. You never know. Derek had keys to the house, of course, and he led the way inside with a confidence that should have set off warning bells in my mind. He was too calm, too prepared, too eager to show me exactly where to look. The basement first, he insisted. That's where someone would go if they wanted complete privacy. The basement of our childhood home was finished, but rarely used, mainly storage for holiday decorations and Dad's old case files. Derek flicked on the lights and started down the wooden stairs. "Marcus," he called out, his voice echoing in the space below. "Are you down here, buddy?" That's when I heard it. A weak sound, barely human, coming from the far corner behind Dad's old filing cabinets. Derek heard it too, and for just a split second, I saw something cross his face that wasn't surprise or hope. It was resignation, like someone whose carefully planned lie was finally falling apart. My heart started racing as I pushed past him toward the sound, and that's when I found my husband chained to a water pipe like an animal, barely conscious and clearly suffering from days without proper food or water.
The moment the paramedics wheeled Marcus out of our childhood home on a stretcher, I knew our family's private nightmare was about to become very public. News crews were already gathering on the street, drawn by the emergency vehicles and the whispered rumors that something involving Chief Justice Chen's family was unfolding in Georgetown. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the windows of our neighbors' houses, and I could see curtains twitching as people tried to get a glimpse of the scandal erupting in their prestigious neighborhood. Derek had been arrested immediately, of course. As Marcus was being loaded into the ambulance, barely conscious but alive, my brother stood in our parents' driveway with his hands cuffed behind his back, staring at the ground like a child who had been caught breaking something valuable. The contrast was stark. Marcus fighting for his life after days of imprisonment and dehydration, while Derek looked more annoyed than remorseful about being caught.
By the time I reached the hospital, the story was already breaking on local news stations. Supreme Court Justice's son arrested in kidnapping of brother-in-law, read the chyrons scrolling across the bottom of the emergency room television. I watched in horror as our family home appeared on screen, yellow crime scene tape fluttering across the front porch where I had played as a child. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The media attention was immediate and brutal. By the next morning, national news outlets had picked up the story. Cable news panels dissected our family's private life with the ruthless efficiency of legal scholars analyzing a constitutional case. Questions mount about Chief Justice Chen's fitness to serve, declared one headline. Family crisis rocks Supreme Court as Justice's son faces federal kidnapping charges, proclaimed another. The worst part was watching Derek's mugshot appear on every news channel and website. My brother, looking disheveled and defiant, stared out from television screens across the country. The photo captured something I had never seen in his face before, a cold calculation that made him look like a stranger. This wasn't the troubled but familiar Derek who had struggled with addiction and disappointment. This was someone capable of chaining another human being in a basement and watching him suffer for days. What made it even more devastating was learning the details that emerged during Derek's initial court appearance. The prosecutor laid out evidence that Derek had been planning Marcus's kidnapping for weeks. He had stolen a spare key to our house, researched Marcus's jogging routine, and even purchased the chains and padlock in advance. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of mental breakdown. It was premeditated and methodical. The press coverage focused heavily on Dad's position on the Supreme Court. Legal analysts speculated about whether he would recuse himself from cases involving criminal justice, whether the scandal would affect pending decisions, whether he could maintain his judicial objectivity while his own son faced federal kidnapping charges. Editorial writers questioned whether Chief Justice Chen could continue to serve while his family was at the center of such a high-profile criminal case. Social media was even worse. Twitter exploded with memes about the Supreme Court Justice's criminal son and conspiracy theories about what our family must have been hiding. People posted photos of our Georgetown house with comments about rich family secrets and privileged justice. Derek's arrest became a symbol for everything people hated about wealthy, connected families who seemed to operate by different rules than everyone else. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially the media. Chief Justice Chen, who had built his reputation on the principle that no one was above the law, now had to watch that principle applied to his own son in the most public way possible. I spent the first 3 days after Derek's arrest in a fog of disbelief and misplaced loyalty. Sitting beside Marcus's hospital bed, watching him recover from dehydration and the psychological trauma of his imprisonment, I kept telling myself that there had to be an explanation, that Derek couldn't have really meant to hurt Marcus, that maybe it was a horrible misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. Mom had been calling nonstop, begging me to visit Derek in jail. "He's asking for you, Sarah," she sobbed into the phone. "He says he needs to explain everything to you. He says you're the only one who will understand." Dad had been strangely quiet, spending long hours in his study, presumably dealing with the political and professional fallout from having a son charged with federal kidnapping. It was Marcus who finally forced me to see the truth. On his 4th day in the hospital, when the doctor said his physical recovery was progressing well, he grabbed my hand with a strength that surprised me. His voice was still hoarse from dehydration, but his words were clear and devastating. "Sarah," he said, looking directly into my eyes, "your brother told me he was going to kill me. Not in a moment of rage, not as a threat. He explained it to me like he was discussing the weather. He says I had taken his place in your family, and the only way to get it back was to make me disappear permanently."
The words hit me like a physical blow. I had been prepared to hear that Derek had mental health issues, that he had been drunk or high when he took Marcus, that he had intended to release him after making some kind of point. But premeditated murder? The brother I had grown up with who used to help me with homework and drive me to piano lessons? He showed me newspaper clippings, articles about missing persons cases that were never solved. He said the basement in your parents' house was perfect because no one would ever think to look there, and by the time anyone found my body, it would be too late to trace it back to him. That night, alone in our townhouse, for the first time since the nightmare began, I sat in Marcus's home office and really looked at the evidence that had been presented at Derek's arraignment. The prosecution had security camera footage of Derek purchasing chains and padlocks at 3 different hardware stores over 2 weeks. They had his internet search history, which included research on how long a person could survive without food and water, and detailed maps of Marcus's jogging route. This wasn't my troubled brother making a desperate mistake. This was a predator who had been planning to murder my husband and had been methodical enough to research how to do it without getting caught. The turning point came when Derek's public defender called me directly. "Ms. Chen-Morrison," he said, "your brother wants to make a deal. He's willing to plead guilty to kidnapping in exchange for having the attempted murder charges dropped. But he needs family support at sentencing. He needs you to testify about his character, about his mental health struggles." In that moment, staring at a photo of Marcus and me on our wedding day, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. My husband could have died in that basement while I spent years making excuses for Derek's behavior, while our family enabled his increasingly dangerous choices, while we all pretended that his problems were just temporary setbacks rather than signs of something much darker. "No," I said into the phone, my voice steady for the first time in days. "I won't be testifying on Derek's behalf. He tried to murder my husband. Family doesn't excuse that." My decision to refuse supporting Derek sent shockwaves through our family that were almost as devastating as his original crime. Mom called me sobbing, accusing me of abandoning my brother when he needed me most. "How can you turn your back on family?" she demanded. "He's sick, Sarah. He needs help, not more punishment." But I had Marcus to think about now, and the husband who had nearly died in our childhood basement mattered more than the brother who had put him there. Dad's response was more complicated and ultimately more supportive. 2 days after I refused to testify for Derek, he appeared at our front door carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the grim expression I remembered from my childhood when he was preparing for particularly difficult cases. "We need to talk," he said simply, settling into our living room like he was about to deliver a judicial opinion. "Sarah," he began, his voice carrying the same measured authority he used from the Supreme Court bench, "I've spent my entire career believing that justice must be blind, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. Your brother committed a serious federal crime with the intent to commit murder. The evidence against him is overwhelming, and his victim is my son-in-law." He paused, looking directly at me. "I'm proud of you for choosing justice over misguided family loyalty." What I hadn't expected was Dad's offer to help us navigate the legal system. As Chief Justice, he couldn't be directly involved in Derek's case, but he could connect us with the best prosecutors and victim advocates in the federal system. "Marcus deserves every protection the law can provide," he said, "and Derek needs to face the full consequences of his choices. Not because I don't love him, but because I do." The federal prosecutor assigned to Derek's case was Amanda Rodriguez, a no-nonsense career prosecutor who specialized in violent crimes. When we met with her, she laid out the government's evidence with methodical precision: the premeditation, the research into murder methods, the detailed planning that proved Derek's intent to kill Marcus rather than simply hold him prisoner. "Your brother is looking at life in prison," she told us bluntly.
Kidnapping with intent to commit murder is a federal capital offense. The only question is whether he'll plead guilty and accept life without parole or force us to go to trial and risk the death penalty. She leaned forward in her chair. I need to know, will you and Marcus be willing to testify about the impact this crime has had on your lives? The victim impact statement process was more difficult than I had imagined. Working with a federal victim advocate named Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Marcus and I had to document not just the physical harm Derek had caused, but the psychological damage, the ongoing trauma, the way his crime had shattered our sense of safety and family trust. Dr. Walsh explained that our statements would be crucial in helping the judge understand the full scope of Derek's actions. Meanwhile, Derek's defense team was mounting what they called a diminished capacity defense, arguing that his history of addiction and family pressure had compromised his ability to form criminal intent. They wanted to paint him as a victim of circumstance rather than a would-be murderer. My mother had already agreed to testify on his behalf, describing his struggles with addiction and his feelings of inadequacy compared to Marcus. They're going to try to make this about sibling rivalry, Amanda Rodriguez warned us. They'll say Derek was jealous and acted impulsively, not that he was planning a murder. We need to be prepared to counter that narrative with the evidence of his careful planning and his explicit threats to kill Marcus.
The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. had never felt more imposing than it did on the morning of Derek's sentencing hearing. Marcus and I walked through the metal detectors hand in hand, past news cameras and reporters shouting questions we refused to answer. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had grown up visiting courthouses with Dad, thinking of them as temples of justice, and now I was walking into one to watch my own brother face the consequences of trying to murder my husband. Derek's plea bargain had been finalized 2 weeks earlier. Rather than risk the death penalty at trial, he had agreed to plead guilty to kidnapping with intent to commit murder and accept life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the judge still needed to hear victim impact statements before making the sentence official, and that's where our family's private war would be fought in open court. Mom sat in the front row behind Derek's table, clutching a tissue box and occasionally glaring at Marcus and me with unconcealed resentment. She had never forgiven us for refusing to support Derek's plea for leniency, and her testimony on his behalf had painted Marcus and me as cold and unforgiving family members who had abandoned Derek in his time of greatest need. When Judge Patricia Collins called the court to order, I felt the weight of every eye in the packed courtroom. This wasn't just Derek's sentencing. It was a public examination of our family's dysfunction, broadcast live on court TV and analyzed in real time by legal commentators across the country. Derek himself looked smaller than I remembered, dressed in an orange federal jumpsuit that made him appear young and vulnerable. But when his lawyer stood up to present the defense's case for leniency, Derek's expression hardened into something I barely recognized. This was the face Marcus had seen in the basement, the cold calculation of someone who had planned murder and felt justified in his actions. "Your Honor," Derek's public defender began, "my client is the product of a family that demanded perfection and punished failure. He watched his brother-in-law receive the love and approval that he had always craved, and in a moment of mental breakdown, he made a terrible decision that he will regret for the rest of his life." But when Marcus took the witness stand to give his victim impact statement, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was steady and clear as he described the 4 days he had spent chained in our basement, believing he was going to die, while Derek explained in detail how he planned to dispose of the body. "Derek Chen didn't kidnap me in a moment of passion or mental illness," Marcus said, looking directly at the judge. "He told me he had been planning my murder for months. He showed me news articles about unsolved missing persons cases and explained how he was going to make me disappear permanently. This wasn't a cry for help or a family dispute that got out of hand.
This was attempted murder, planned and executed by someone who felt entitled to take my life because he was jealous of my marriage to his sister. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and looked at Derek for the first time since his arrest. He was staring at me with an expression that mixed hurt and fury, as if I were betraying him rather than telling the truth about what he had done. "Derek is my brother," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "But he is also someone who tried to murder my husband and destroy my family. Love doesn't excuse attempted murder. Family loyalty doesn't override justice. I am here today to support the prosecution's recommendation for life in prison because some crimes are unforgivable, even when they're committed by people we love."
Judge Collins took a full 15 minutes to review the case files before delivering Derek's sentence. The courtroom was so quiet during those minutes that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Marcus squeezed my hand as we watched the judge read through victim impact statements, psychiatric evaluations, and evidence reports with the careful attention of someone who understood that this decision would define the rest of multiple lives. When Judge Collins finally looked up, her expression was stern and uncompromising. "Mr. Derek Chen," she began, her voice carrying the full authority of the federal court system. "You have pleaded guilty to kidnapping with intent to commit murder. The evidence presented to this court shows that your crime was not impulsive or the result of mental illness, but rather a calculated plan to murder your brother-in-law out of jealousy and resentment." Derek stood between his lawyers, his hands shackled at his waist, looking straight ahead without expression. But I could see his jaw clenching as Judge Collins continued her analysis of his crime and character. "The court has heard testimony that you held Mr. Marcus Morrison prisoner for 4 days, during which time you explicitly told him of your intention to kill him and dispose of his body. You showed him newspaper clippings of unsolved missing persons cases as examples of how you planned to make him disappear permanently. This was not a family dispute or a moment of poor judgment. This was attempted murder in the first degree." Judge Collins paused, looking directly at Derek. "You have shown no genuine remorse for your actions. Your letters to the court and your mother's testimony suggest that you view yourself as a victim of family circumstances rather than as someone who nearly committed one of the most serious crimes in our legal system. This lack of accountability, combined with the premeditated nature of your crime, convinces this court that you pose a continuing danger to society." The formal sentencing took less than 2 minutes. "Derek Chen, you are hereby sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. You will serve this sentence at ADX Florence, a maximum security facility designed for the most dangerous federal offenders. You are also ordered to pay restitution to your victim in the amount of $50,000 for medical expenses and psychological treatment." ADX Florence. I had heard Dad mention that facility before. It was where they sent terrorists, spies, and the most violent criminals in the federal system. Derek would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, isolated from general population, with minimal human contact, and no hope of ever walking free again. Derek's reaction was immediate and explosive. "This is insane," he shouted, spinning around to face our family section of the courtroom. "Sarah, how can you let them do this to me? I'm your brother. This is all because you chose him over your own family." The bailiffs moved quickly to restrain him as he continued yelling, his composure finally cracking under the weight of his life sentence. "Mom, tell them," he screamed as they dragged him toward the holding area. "Tell them I was sick. Tell them I didn't mean it." But even Mom had fallen silent, staring at her son as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The man being hauled away by federal marshals wasn't the troubled but lovable Derek she had spent years defending. This was someone capable of chaining another human being in a basement and calmly planning their murder. As Derek disappeared through the holding room door, still shouting threats and accusations, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or revenge, but a deep, settled sense of justice.
finally being served.
2 weeks after Derek's sentencing, FBI agent Monica Torres called with information that would shatter what remained of my understanding of my brother. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, her voice careful and professional, "we've been investigating some cold cases that might be connected to your brother's activities. Would you and your husband be willing to come in for an interview?" The FBI field office in downtown Washington felt like stepping into another world. Agent Torres led us through secure corridors lined with photos of wanted fugitives and commendation plaques, finally settling us in a sterile conference room where she spread out a collection of files that made my blood run cold. "After your brother's arrest, we started looking into similar cases involving missing persons in areas where Derek Chen had lived or traveled," Agent Torres explained. "What we've found suggests that Marcus may not have been his first victim." The first file contained photos of James Mitchell, a 28-year-old software engineer from Seattle who had disappeared during a hiking trip 3 years ago. Derek had been living in Seattle then, working for a tech startup that had fired him for erratic behavior just 2 weeks before James vanished. The second file showed Rebecca Santos, a marketing executive from Austin who had gone missing from her apartment complex's parking garage. Derek had briefly dated Rebecca's roommate and had been seen arguing with Rebecca at a bar the night before she disappeared. "We found Derek's internet search history going back 5 years," Agent Torres continued, opening her laptop to show us a timeline that made me feel physically sick. He was researching missing persons cases, studying police investigation methods, and visiting online forums where people discussed how to make someone disappear without leaving evidence. Marcus reached for my hand as Agent Torres showed us more files. 7 people in total, all young professionals in their 20s and 30s, all missing without a trace from cities where Derek had lived or visited. The pattern was consistent. Derek would fixate on someone who seemed to have the life he wanted, study their routines, and then they would simply vanish. "The breakthrough came when we searched your parents' property more thoroughly," Agent Torres said quietly. "We brought in ground-penetrating radar and found disturbed soil patterns in 3 locations around the property grounds. Yesterday, we obtained warrants to begin excavations." The room started spinning around me. Our childhood home, the place where I had learned to ride a bike and celebrated birthdays, might be a burial ground where Derek had hidden his victims. The basement where we found Marcus might have been just the latest in a series of murders that had been going on for years. "How many?" I managed to ask. "We don't know yet," Agent Torres replied, "but we're treating this as one of the most significant serial murder investigations in the region's history. Your brother's life sentence just became the least of his problems." The excavation of our family property took 6 weeks and became a national media spectacle. News crews camped outside the Georgetown house where I had grown up, broadcasting live updates every time the FBI's forensic team made another grisly discovery. By the end, they had found the remains of 4 people buried in our backyard, including James Mitchell and Rebecca Santos, confirming that Derek had been a serial killer for at least 5 years. Mom suffered a complete breakdown when the first body was discovered. She was hospitalized for severe depression and refused to speak to anyone, including Dad and me, for almost a month. When she finally agreed to see us, she was a shadow of the strong, composed woman who had once been a federal prosecutor. "How did I not know?" she kept repeating. "How did I live in that house and not know there were dead people in my garden?" Dad handled the revelations with the stoic dignity he had cultivated over 3 decades on the federal bench, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the man who had built his career on the principle that justice must be blind, was now watching his own son revealed as one of the most notorious serial killers in recent memory. "I keep thinking about all the cases I've heard," he told me during one of our weekly dinners that had become our new tradition. "All the families of murder victims who stood before my court seeking justice. Now I understand their pain in a way I never wanted to." He paused, staring at his untouched plate. "Your mother thinks we failed Derek somehow, that we should have seen the signs. But Sarah, I've read the FBI's psychological profile. Derek wasn't made into a killer by anything we did or didn't do. He was simply born without a conscience."
The hardest part was dealing with the families of Derek's victims. James Mitchell's parents flew in from Seattle to attend the press conference where the FBI announced that their son's disappearance had finally been solved. His mother, Patricia Mitchell, approached me afterward with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, gripping my hands with surprising strength. "If you hadn't fought for justice when your brother hurt your husband, we never would have learned what happened to James. We've spent 3 years wondering if he was alive somewhere, if we should keep hoping. Now we can finally lay our son to rest." Rebecca Santos' sister Maria was less gracious, but no less grateful. "Your family protected a monster for years," she told me bluntly during another press conference. "But at least you finally did the right thing when it mattered. Rebecca can finally have justice." The final legal proceedings took another year. Derek was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, in addition to his existing kidnapping conviction. This time, the federal prosecutors pursued the death penalty, and Derek's defense team couldn't argue mental illness or family dysfunction when faced with evidence of systematic, premeditated murder over multiple years. Throughout the trial, Mom refused to testify on Derek's behalf. She had finally seen him for what he really was, and the cognitive dissonance of loving someone who had committed such horrific crimes had broken something fundamental in her worldview. Dad maintained his judicial recusal from any cases related to Derek, but privately told me he supported the death penalty verdict that eventually came down. Derek showed no remorse even when facing execution, maintaining that his victims had deserved their fates for having lives he envied. His final statement to the court was a rambling justification of his actions that convinced even his most sympathetic supporters that he was beyond redemption or rehabilitation.
5 years have passed since I found Marcus chained in our childhood basement, and I'm writing this from the sun-drenched kitchen of our new home in Boulder, Colorado. We moved here 2 years ago, seeking distance from the Washington, D.C. area, where every courthouse and news station held memories of our family's darkest chapter. Marcus has thrived at his new environmental law firm, and I've found meaningful work with a nonprofit that provides legal advocacy for victims of violent crime. Our daughter Emma is 3 years old now, a bright and fearless little girl who fills our house with laughter and reminds us daily that life can be beautiful despite the darkness we've survived. She knows nothing about Uncle Derek, and if we're fortunate, she never will. The story she'll grow up with is simpler and healthier, that sometimes people make very bad choices, and when they do, there have to be consequences. Marcus still sees a therapist weekly to deal with the lingering effects of his trauma. He has nightmares sometimes, and certain enclosed spaces still trigger panic attacks. But he's rebuilt his sense of safety through patient work with Dr. Rachel Kim, a specialist in treating victims of violent crime. Healing isn't about forgetting what happened, he often tells people who ask about his recovery. It's about learning to build a life where what happened doesn't control your future. My relationship with my parents has evolved into something more honest but more distant than it was before Derek's crimes came to light. Dad retired from the Supreme Court 6 months after Derek's execution, citing his desire to spend time with his family and process the trauma of learning that his son was a serial killer. He and Mom moved to a small house in Asheville, North Carolina, where they're slowly learning to live with the knowledge that they raised both a daughter who fought for justice and a son who became a monster. Mom has made remarkable progress in therapy, though she'll never fully recover from the guilt of not recognizing Derek's true nature. She sends Emma birthday cards and Christmas presents, and we video chat monthly, but there's an unspoken understanding that our relationship will always be shadowed by what we've been through. She's begun volunteering with families of murder victims, finding some measure of peace and helping others navigate the complex grief of loving someone who was taken by violence. I used to think that unconditional love meant accepting everything someone did, she told me during our last phone call. Now I understand that real love sometimes means letting someone face the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences are devastating. The most unexpected source of healing has come through my work with the Violent Crime Victims Legal Advocacy Center. Helping other families navigate the legal system when their loved ones have been hurt or killed has given me a sense of purpose that I never found in my previous career. I've learned that my experience with Derek, as horrific as it was, has given me unique insight into how families can be manipulated into protecting perpetrators rather than supporting victims. Last month, I testified before a congressional subcommittee about the need for better resources for families dealing with violent crime committed by relatives. The hardest part, I told the panel of lawmakers, isn't accepting that someone you love committed a terrible crime. It's learning to forgive yourself for not seeing the signs earlier, for not protecting their victims, for all the times you chose family loyalty over moral clarity. Derek was executed 18 months ago, and I didn't attend. Neither did our parents. He had spent his final years on death row maintaining his innocence, despite overwhelming evidence, writing long letters to anyone who would listen about how he had been framed by a justice system that needed a scapegoat for unsolved cases. Even facing death, he was incapable of genuine remorse or accountability. I felt relief when the warden called to confirm that the execution had been carried out, but not the closure I had expected. Derek's death didn't undo the trauma he had caused or bring back his victims. It simply meant that he could no longer hurt anyone else, which was perhaps the most important outcome of all. Emma's laughter from the backyard interrupts my writing, and through the kitchen window I can see her chasing butterflies between the tomato plants Marcus and I planted this spring. She's growing up in a home where love is unconditional but boundaries are clear, where family means safety and support rather than obligation and manipulation. The most important lesson I've learned from our ordeal is that choosing justice over family loyalty isn't betrayal, it's love in its truest form. By refusing to enable Derek's violence, by supporting the legal consequences he faced, by protecting Marcus and other potential victims, I honored the best values our family had taught me, even when doing so meant losing the family I thought I knew. Sometimes I wonder who I might have become if I had chosen differently, if I had prioritized Derek's freedom over Marcus's safety, if I had been one more family member making excuses for inexcusable behavior. But watching Emma play in our peaceful garden, knowing that Marcus and I built this life by choosing truth over comfort, I have no regrets about the path that brought us here.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.